The Life of Herod the Great, written by Zora Neale Hurston, and published in January of 2025 by Amistad, with a snippet read by Richard Coombs. Available for checkout right now at the Alice L. Pendleton Library. The common court of the Temple of Zorobabel at Jerusalem was crowded to capacity, but in complete silence. But silence had many personalities. This profound absence of sound was filled with the hysteria of hope, for the people gathered here had been hastily summoned by Antipater, the most powerful citizen of Judea, who now stood in the erect posture of a soldier on the speaker's platform, with his left hand stretched out and resting on a lectern. Standing thus before the congregation, his physical power spoke. In his middle years, with a slight brush of gray at his temples, he showed no other signs that he was past his youth. 6 feet of brawn and steady, determined eyes, a strong, handsome face, and dignity of poise. And now, without any preliminaries, Antipater began to speak. Behind him, the 70 sat in a large semicircle, with Hyrcanus, the high priest, in the center, making the required 71. As if driven by a wind, the semicircle leaned forward to better hear. Before him, the vast throng bowed forward likewise. The cluster of large candles illuminated the platform and threw everything on it in high relief. As you know, the great Caesar was in Syria to settle the affairs of our nation, and you are aware of the disposition he made. And further, that I have but recently escorted him as far as Antioch, from which port he sailed to Rome. My most recent activities on my return from Antioch have consisted in going over the country and quelling the disorders which I found, and which, if left to continue, would have plunged our country again into the horrors of civil strife. Antipater swept the room with grim eyes. The current chaotic state of affairs, I, as your governor, appointed by Caesar with full support of the Senate, will in no wise tolerate. It was upon my recommendation to Caesar that Hyrcanus be restored as your high priest, of which office he was wickedly deprived by Aristobulus, his brother. And if you will abandon the wicked and destructive practices of this Aristobulus, who is now dead, and behave towards Hyrcanus as is right and proper, I guarantee that you shall live happily, and live your lives without disturbance in the enjoyment of your possessions. But if any of you are addicted to the frigid hopes of what you might gain by innovations, and aim to get wealthy by such means, you will find in me a most severe master instead of a gentle governor, and Hyrcanus a tyrant instead of a king, and the Romans, including Caesar, your bitter enemies, for be assured the Romans will never bear to be set aside those whom they have appointed to govern you. Instantly, a murmur like a fire in the woods swept the room, and almost as quickly it was changed to loud applause. This continued for 2 or 3 minutes unabated. Behind Antipater, Hyrcanus was doing his utmost to participate, but his efforts were confusing. First, he smiled broadly, with his head nodding and bobbing excessively to indicate that he not only approved, but had actually commanded Antipater to say what he did. Then he decided that this was the wrong gesture, as indeed it was, for many took to tittering at him. Then he overdid a stern frown at the populace, which caused many to titter more in derision. Finally, the clamor for the return of peace, prosperity, and security, as expressed by the tumultuous applause, died away, and Antipater continued. And to further make certain of the restoration of security and prosperity, which we all so desire, I call to my assistance Phasaelus, my firstborn son, and appoint him governor of Jerusalem and the places about. He will make it his obligation to restore the perfect order of former times, so that each citizen, of whatever class, may enjoy security for himself, his family, and his possessions, and second, to rebuild the walls of the city thrown down by Pompey. Then even louder and more prolonged applause interrupted Antipater. Seeing himself unable to continue immediately, he turned his clean-shaven face to the right and nodded, and Phasaelus rose and stood, and was acknowledged by the populace with thunderous applause and the calling of his name in praise and favor. With Phasaelus still standing at Antipater's right hand, the procurator spoke again. And to the end that all parts and provinces of our nation be quieted and protected alike, I appoint my second son, Herod, to be governor of Galilee, our most northern province, to put down the tumults there, which have come about through the civil strife in the nations, and thus have a handle to those who prefer to live by unlawful means to the injury of honest and pious men. At his father's nod, Herod arose and stood at the Antipater's left. He rose with a swagger, and his broad, self-assured smile took the gathering into his arms. The place went wild. With a few bitter exceptions, men cheered, shouted, and called his name, and kept cheering. Why? Not one of them could have said exactly why he was so stimulated at the sight of this young man. Certainly Herod was a good 2 inches taller than his father or brother, but they were tall enough to satisfy. He was extraordinary in his handsomeness, but should they be excited about that? It was perhaps a freak of personality, native to the theater, where some, a very few, can command applause for doing practically nothing, while very competent actors can scarcely gain notice. Herod had that something.